Hello and welcome to this episode of the Housing Geospatial podcast, the podcast where we discuss anything and everything that relates to either housing or geospatial, preferably if there's a little bit of both. Housing Geospatial was formed as we believe place matters for social housing and that geospatial information is woefully underrepresented in the housing sector. The series is around sharing a collective knowledge within the housing sector. You can find us on either our LinkedIn page or feel free to head on over to our website at www.housinggeospatial.co.uk. I am your host, Chris Kinnear, and I am joined today by the massively mapping enthusiast, Claire Burney, who is the founder of Maptastic. Thanks for joining us today, Claire.
Hi, Chris.
So first question, how are you involved in either housing and or geospatial?
I suppose I'm more involved in the housing before it gets built, to be honest. I create a lot of mapping and data that's used in the planning process and in the environment profession and overall, but I spend my days doing geospatial solely, essentially.
That's awesome. So obviously geospatial is amazing. So you are the founder of Maptastic. Can you tell us a little bit more about Maptastic and some of the services that you offer?
Sure. I have three areas of work. I do mapping for you, I do it with you, or I teach you how to do it yourself. So in reality, that's completing habitat mapping for ecologists and biodiversity net gain assessments, or I make workflow templates so they can create their data more easily themselves, or I train people to do it themselves.
So that's a really nice, I really like the three-step thing, either do it for you, with you, or train you how to do it. From our chats, you have had such an amazing career leading up to founding Maptastic. Can you tell us more about your geospatial career?
Sure. I'm a bit of a career changer, to be honest. I started out in finance in my early 20s doing disaster recovery for insurance companies, but that was particularly unfulfilling. So I went and did an environment degree at York University in my late 20s. And when I graduated, I got my first job in the Environment Agency doing flood risk mapping. I did some GIS modules at uni and really enjoyed it and seemed to be quite good at it. So I spent a few years doing flood risk mapping. Then I went into construction companies, HS2, things like that in their GIS teams, working with data and stakeholders and the usual things you do when you're in consultancy. Then I went to the Ordnance Survey and was a kind of customer relations manager for the Northern Yorkshire area. I mean, that's quite a big area, part of a Northern contingent team. And then after that, I launched Maptastic. So it's been a bit of a blur over 10 years in geospatial, to be honest.
That's really fascinating, especially doing the flood risk mapping. Oh, I could talk to you loads about flood risk mapping. Maybe in a bit we'll get back to that. So you do a lot of environmental mapping, and that's kind of a huge core of your business. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so the environment mapping can be anything from doing breeding bird surveys, badger set mapping, bat emergence surveys, preliminary roost assessments. So anything an ecologist or an environment consultancy wants, they get in touch, they tell me what they need, and I'll essentially create them any map and data that they'd like. More recently, it's just been, oh, I need a reptile survey adding to this site survey. So they give me an example of what they want. I create them a map, tell them if they need any feedback and that kind of thing. So it's really wide ranging. So anything an ecologist would do on a site, I put it in a map.
Okay, so I think what we'll do is we'll ask the next question and then we'll kind of talk more about that kind of cool stuff with environmental mapping.
Sure.
So on the podcast, we've talked about biodiversity net gain before, BNG. Can you tell us a bit more about what it is?
Yeah, so the maps for biodiversity net gain are there to support the applications of developments. So I use the template that Natural England has created, as it's an excellent way to populate the site data before it's exported to the metric as like a one and done process. So the way it normally goes is a client will send me their survey map from their site, the client data to support that, such as topographic surveys, red line boundaries, and the post-development information if they have it. Obviously, the cycle that it might be pre-development application, it might be just a baseline to get the unit calculation, or it could be all three: baseline, post-development, and metric. So the mapping for BNG is something that I think isn't data first. So not everyone is using the templates, or they're filling in the metric manually, and there's not really an onus to use geospatial in BNG, and a lot of people aren't. More and more people are, because it is a really good tool, but then the data quality behind that isn't well supported. So how to get a good red line boundary, what is a red line boundary, how to do accurate mapping. And I think Jonathan went into that last time, of just accurate data collection and creation, and what you need to do in terms of geospatial metadata to be able to make sure that you're getting the right site data first.
So I think, yeah, that's really cool. I think just to clarify about what biodiversity net gain is, that was a piece of legislation brought in a couple of years ago, where every development has to exceed a habitat threshold of 10%, and for ecosystem health and things. So it's really interesting where you're talking about things like data quality. And I think, and actually, this brings us kind of onto another one of our questions as well, is, as you mentioned about Jonathan Gatwood being on the podcast before, some of the high level discussing some of the high level challenges with BNG. What are some of the practical challenges you've observed? You've already talked about some of them, but what are some more of those challenges within it?
Yeah, so I'd say day to day, the challenges are acquiring data. So a number of companies don't give me anything more than PDFs to work with, which is quite a risky strategy. But obviously, if that's only the only data that you have, that's what you have to work with. And I just put caveats to say that I'm working with PDFs. This isn't an exact site outline. And I just put, I give my clients wording to help them ask for data from their clients. So I feel that a lot of it is because ecology is quite a small, there's a lot of small businesses, there are a lot of micro consultancies, and they're not responsible for creating the DXF data, they're not responsible for doing the surveys, they're not responsible for post-development. So they're the person who is kind of like the interim between me and a developer, and the standard of data between a very large consultancy who has geospatial teams, they have engineers, they have everyone working on a certain standard. Individual micro businesses will do it their own way, and I'm just the guy at the end of the chain who's begging for a DXF that's geo-referenced. So day to day, it's things like the DXF or the DWG is not geo-referenced correctly. So it's either on the west coast of Cornwall, or it's even just like the South Africa, or it's just loaded anywhere on the globe that isn't where your site is. So then you have to transform it, because sometimes it's actually larger than, say, Russia in terms of size. So they're using millimeters generally for CAD software, and I'm using meters. So if they haven't georeferenced it and scaled it correctly, I'll load it into GIS and it'll be huge. So I then have to transform the data and physically move it to the site location. Inherently, that's not a bad thing to do. I can do that, but when you start transforming things and moving things, there is going to be inherently potentially an error, because I don't necessarily know that their DXF is definitely scalable by the numbers I'm putting in. And it has come about sometimes when I've scaled it by my traditional numbers and it's still off. And I'm like, oh, so what scale have they used? So it would be, in an ideal world, I would have these things, but I think the disjointed way in which planning is done, the whole cycle from the developer doing their architect stuff all the way through to the actual submission, it's not a clear process and there's no defined way of doing things. Does that help?
That's, you know what, that made, I hadn't considered that, because I knew obviously when you brought in like a CAD drawing or DXF or something, but I hadn't thought about the architect's difference of millimeters versus meters. And you're right, yeah, if you've got a big enough site, that would just become massive in what you're representing.
One of them was literally larger than the universe. So OpenStreetMap was down in the bottom left, and my site was up in the top right. It was huge. So I don't know what they've done. Other things, I think Jonathan went into this in the previous podcast, is the way in which CAD files are created. So a lot of them are line strings where they're representing polygon features, and so they're not closed lines. So if I'm tracing over post-development, especially for really big sites, I sometimes have to hand digitize a lot of things, because you cannot use the tracing features and stuff, because the line data just suddenly ends and it corrupts it. So the post development not being created in a way that's useful, or they have a load of features that I don't need to see. So like I would rather just have the things I need to clip up for post development. I don't necessarily need to see every single planting circle. I just need the bed. So we'll have things like shrubs that are nice. They look nice on a drawing, but actually I don't need curvy shrubs. I just need the general area.
That's another point as well, isn't it? Like, because there's obviously a difference of purpose for something like CAD, for example, from a builder versus what's needed for you as a mapping for ecologists.
Yeah, because those like curvy shapes, you'll get an area calculation for that, and it's very unlikely that that shrub is going to literally be like this.
Yeah.
So a generalized area would be preferable, but obviously I've got to work with what I get given.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that as well. So you've kind of hinted a little bit about this in kind of your chat. But what's something a bit more definitive we could do to make BNG mapping a bit better?
I think it would be a digital first approach from the BNG process. So, Natural England and the government who are requiring this information for the legislation, setting out some standards. So asking for specifics and repeatable and defined processes. So there's, I think Jonathan will have mentioned it, the FreeDAS white paper that Ecospatial, Katie from Ecospatial has published, of just some really easy digestible metadata for geospatial that could be easily incorporated into the process. And it shouldn't be too arduous for even non-geospatial users to learn and to create. Because obviously I'm a geospatial specialist, it's something I do anyway. But for ecologists, it's not their main job to do this. It is an additional task and an additional skill for them to learn. They need to have it to be a lower barrier to entry, because GIS is not something you generally can just rock up and do. You do have to learn, and there are tips and tricks to be able to make it repeatable and consistent and an easy process.
I think, and I you know what, I agree with you in all of that, because the bit that really resonates with me is the fact that like ecologists aren't data specialists, they're specialists in nature, and they're being asked to do this quite arduous, quite technical process that also is legally liable. I think Jonathan was saying like it's up to 5 years after you can be audited or something, and that's especially with like if you're using Google Maps or something as like your baseline drawing. I didn't quite realize the implications of that until when we were talking about it with Jonathan. One of the things that sorry, carry on, go on.
Especially Section 106 agreements for HMMPs, the kind of monitoring plans. So some sites will have monitoring plans for up to 30 years. If you've made a red line boundary on someone else's land accidentally, what's the implications of that? Who's liable for that? Am I liable for that because I've made the data? And that's why I'm really stringent about I'm not doing this on Google Maps. I'm not doing it on OpenStreetMap. I'm going to get you better data. But what happens in 30 years' time when someone is actually looking at this information? It's like, well, who created that? When did they create it? What data sources did they use? And I just don't think we're thinking enough about the accuracy and precision of what we're doing at the moment. And I think that is led from when the legislation was created. It was not data first. It was to do with the metric that was like manual. And I don't know who was in the room, obviously, but I don't feel that there was enough onus put on the quality of the data.
So this is actually going to be kind of another question I'm going to ask for you. So I've got it's going to break it down into two questions. One is you've already talked about QGIS, and we'll talk about that one in a moment. But the first one is when we talk about buying better data, you don't want to use things like OpenStreetMap or Google Maps just because of that. I don't want to use the word validity. OpenStreetMaps and Google Maps are great in their own respects and the technologies they're designed for, or the purpose they're designed for. So when you're choosing to buy better data, and I'm going to put that in inverted quotes if anyone can't see the recording, what do you mean by better data? Who do you buy data from, like those kinds of things to help support your mapping to create the best product you can do?
Yeah, so I would go for OS, Ordnance Survey topography, if I had nothing else. And there's a number of partners who can sell that on. So there's Blue Sky, eMapSite, other data sources are available. So you could go directly to the Ordnance Survey, I believe, but I think it's very much easier to go to a partner where you can just log into their website, set a site boundary, and you can download topography, aerials, all that kind of stuff for your site. If aerials are required, I definitely go to the aerial imagery from those providers, because you can get up to 5 centimeter resolution, which is much better than obviously Google Satellite can ever provide. Ideally, it would be great to have a client topography survey, actual topo survey. So on the ground data is still better than Ordnance Survey topo, because that only shows you a certain currency of data. You don't know when it was last surveyed, particularly in rural areas, and it also shows site boundaries, but not necessarily the nuances of where a building is exactly, things like that. So I would always want a topo survey of the site as the gold standard. That would be great.
One group you have mentioned, Blue Sky. Yeah. And you talk about buying potentially topo, and like you said, there's EMAP site, IODocs, and everything else.
Yeah.
If you're buying aerial imagery, do you typically tend to go towards more Blue Sky? Because that's what I've done in the past. I've used Blue Sky's aerial data just because I found it's more in line with what we need than this is when I was doing grounds maintenance mapping. Do you tend to use Blue Sky, or are there others that you use as well?
I tend to use Blue Sky unless a client particularly has a preferred provider, because their licensing is very clear. I can use it in my static mapping for my clients. I am just not permitted to send them the data. So it's a really clear license agreement for me to be able to illustrate that to my client, to say, I'm happy to purchase this data on your behalf, but these are the license agreements. And it's just nice and clear for me. And I like clear-cut license agreements. The others may also do that, but Blue Sky was just my first port of call, and it's always been something that I buy from them. But I don't think the quality is any different with the other sites. I think they all have really good quality data.
So that's a really important part and a real key fundamental of this podcast, chatting about not saying who to go to, but there are options to buy data from.
Yeah.
The next thing, you've talked about it a little bit, QGIS. Now, QGIS is a great big open source GIS, and it's probably how, between that and Esri, is probably how most people get into GIS. Can you tell us a bit about why you use QGIS, a bit about your history of using QGIS, and kind of and kind of some of the good stuff you've done using QGIS for Maptastic?
Yeah, so QGIS I first learned about in university. We used both ArcMap and QGIS, and we did projects on both to learn the different softwares. They're quite different to when I remember them in university. I think ArcGIS was like 2 point something when I was learning it. And obviously it's ArcPro, but I still use the terminology ArcGIS because I'm old. So QGIS has always been in my life. And then when I went to the Environment Agency, they used MapInfo, ArcGIS, and QGIS as like a three-pronged approach, I suppose. This was back in like 2015, so the licensing again was different with Esri, but they only had a certain amount of licenses, obviously, for certain processes and different teams. So the expectation is that you would use QGIS and MapInfo for certain things, and then ArcGIS for others. And that's been a theme through most of my consultancy life, where there was never one system. There was always people using ArcGIS, QGIS and MapInfo as like a trio, and that was quite a consistent theme, especially if you were working across councils and consultancy and other companies. There was no one to have, so councils tended to use MapInfo, and then we would use QGIS, and then the others would use ArcGIS. With Ordnance Survey was the same. When I worked there, you would have all the flavors of GIS to choose from. So I was software agnostic until I started Maptastic. And QGIS, I'm just more of an open source kind of girly. I like the ethos of open source and being able to use it for wherever you please. And the license fees of Esri are just phenomenal for a small business, a micro business. It's just me. And all my clients are quite familiar with QGIS, and it's obviously free and open source. I do recommend donating at least every time you download, though. Just a tenner would be great. And more recently, I've become a sustaining member of QGIS in the last month or so to give back a little bit from a business that clearly benefits from QGIS. I like that you can do what you like with it. I find the interface quite intuitive and user-friendly. The plugins are always being developed. There's always someone going, I've got a problem, how can I make it better? And I really like the initiative from that community to do that. Things like QField and Mergin Maps and all these other companies who are developing open source solutions, but obviously adding a lot of value while they're doing that to increase the usability and capabilities to rival the proprietary software. And I just like the lack of restriction. You don't need any credits to do anything.
I think so. QField was one I was going to come on to, actually. So QField, I'm just trying to think. Yeah, actually, no, you tell us a bit more about QField and how and what you've developed with QField. Because I think what you've built with it is brilliant.
Yeah, so QField is QField Cloud is kind of like a syncing plugin and company to be able to basically take a QGIS project that you've developed and put it into an app called QField on a tablet, so you can do on-site surveying with your own template. So an example of this would be taking the BNG template from Natural England, and you just do a few tweaks to be able to use it in the field, and then you sync it with QField Cloud, or you could use Mergin Maps is another one, very similar. And it's basically a way of you doing field survey work, and it kind of cuts out that doodling on a bit of paper. You can collect a lot of data in the field, come back into the office, sync it with your QGIS project, and then you take out that step of having to draw it in the field, then digitize it in the office. It kind of cuts out a step. They also have like plugins, and you're able to use satellite software, so you can plug in like a GNSS reader and it can follow you, so you could literally trace in the field around a certain area or the site boundary, and you could create yourself habitats that are really accurate. So yeah, field survey data, I think a lot of people are interested in it, and I think it would be really good for people to start using field data collection, but you just need a little bit of nous to be able to create your template to make it really useful. So if you don't do any site setup and you just start a blank project, you have to hand type everything. So what I've done is create templates that have drop down menus, tick boxes, and all of the kind of features that you would need to just do the data collection, but as well as have metadata in the background that's being collected without you really seeing it. So when you get back in the office, you've got all of this data and information ready to go. Sorry, I really love field data collection. I think it's really awesome.
So this is exactly the thing I was going to get onto, the templates you've created. Now, granted, so yeah, could you just tell us quickly what your templates are? And then I'll ask you another question afterward. I just don't want to muddy this question, really.
No, that's fine. The templates, there's 5 different ones, I think. So there's a habitats one, so that's UK Habs and BNG. So that has the styling, symbols and data collection for both UK Habs and Biodiversity Net Gain. And essentially I've created the geo packages with styling, labeling, symbology, everything you might need to load the template, press the buttons for lines, points and polygons, and it will just instantaneously symbolize it, make it look like the UK Hab symbols, do all the data collection for you without you having to like hand type anything. And then there's outputs with their branding, my client's branding, logos and style preferences essentially, and the reporting that supports that. So it's kind of like a one and done process, that all the hard work of making automated workflows for them. So GIS in your pocket from a GIS expert who works with ecologists.
So I think that's brilliant, especially like when you think about like the biodiversity net gain mapping, because we've already discussed how challenging that can be, especially if you're using not the best data for that legal liability. I think that's probably the safest way of arguing that point.
Yeah.
From a housing perspective, the thing I quite like is how you said you can connect in your satellite data so you can do a follow through. Now, in my mind, if you're doing like from a housing perspective, you could draw in, like, let's say if you're a developer, for example, you could do your land boundary of what you're drawing, and then that could be loaded in. You could also do your pathways, because sometimes that data is not available. So if you wanted to understand, for example, when housing, you might think of like, I guess, ASBs or crime spots or almost like negative spots within your estate, you could walk around with it, and then you could, so you've got all your pathways, and then you could map where it is. and it's probably going to be in locations where it's inaccessible, or it's a bit hidden, or you've got poor street lighting. Oh yeah, that's really cool. So OS have just released their street lighting data,
They
haven't
have just
they?
released that. That would be really interesting to sort of load in for your customers. But yeah, with housing, you could just have your assets all loaded into a QGIS and QField template and have like a notes section. So as you're doing your inspections, you can just click a point and just go, remember to do this later, or this street light is out, or, you know, those types of things. You could just have all of that data in the template. The user would then click on the item and make their notes. The date and time would already be populated. The user would be pre-populated because you'd get that from the system. All of that metadata to have your audit trail of this was inspected this day and time, and this is how we prove it, because, you know, Joe Blogs was at this location at this date, because it's not something the users put in, it's something you've put into your template as a back-end process.
That's
I know,
really
it's
cool.
just so sexy, isn't it? It's so good.
I'm just trying to think. Earlier on, we talked a bit about flood mapping.
Yeah.
And we've and Richard Flemings from Map Impact joined us, and he said about mapping. He talked about how flooding was like seen as the standard thing of climate change, but actually wildfires and droughts are going to be more. But actually, if we could chat about how you map flood data, because you said you did a bit of that.
I did several years of it, yeah.
Could you give a very broad understanding of how we map flood data? I think that'd be really cool.
So obviously it was like 10 years ago I did this, so it may have changed, but the Environment Agency release flood zones 2 and 3 and surface water flood risk as shapefiles or geopackages and main rivers. So as a rudimentary flood risk assessment, you could load in those layers, load in your housing assets, and look at the different ranges of where your houses relate to. I think they also have flood modelling, and I don't know whether they still release or do release their flood modelling to show the different, like 1 in 50 year, 1 in 100 year, that kind of thing, that might be still inbuilt with the data of flood zone 2 and flood zone 3. But I know that a lot of insurance companies are using flood zone modelling themselves. They do their own modelling, or you could rudimentarily just use the Environment Agency's data, which has recently been updated actually, looking at your housing assets, where they are, and then also the cost of those assets. So if they were flooded, what is the potential cost to your insurance policy? So yeah, flood zone 2, flood zone 3 and main rivers are all available on the DEFRA data downloads, as well as surface water, I believe, because obviously flood water from rivers and stuff is significant, but surface water runoff, as we build more and more things and have different suds and all that stuff with housing, surface water can still do a lot of damage, and I think that's underutilized, I think, in the different ways we use flood risk mapping.
I love talking about data, like environmental
I know
data.
there's just we have so much data in this country that is open source, and obviously whilst the currency and accuracy is kind of averages, it's still such a rich environment of information that our government gives us to at least give us some contextual mapping to start us on that road to accurate data. I love it.
So we're coming up to our final question, and this is kind of this. I don't know how this began, but it has begun. If you had an unlimited budget, what would you do with it?
I would go and live on a small croft to garden a few chickens and bees, and I would live a more slow and intentional life. I'm not even joking. I'm very much getting into the anti-hustle bro is what I'm at right now. Obviously I run my own business, so I have to be a bit of a hustle girl, but I would really love to just live more intentionally and more slowly and garden for the rest of my days. I wouldn't map. I wouldn't come to work. I would absolutely just cut and run.
You know what? I quite like that. The data nerd in me is all about build a big project, do this, but actually just living in the middle of nowhere, being self-sustaining and just chilled. I think that sounds great.
I might like maybe, you know, use my geospatial knowledge for good and help a local charity or a struggling parish council to do some mapping occasionally, but I certainly wouldn't sit here full time if I had an unlimited budget.
Oh, but no, that's a brilliant answer, and I love it for.
Do you want to start a commune with me now?
Oh, that's my thing now. Claire, thank you so much for today. It's been absolutely brilliant having you on and chatting with you. If anyone who's listened wishes to get in touch, what's the best way for them to do so?
On LinkedIn, I'm usually on there at Claire Louise Burney, and I think you'll put the thing in the description probably, or at maptastic.co.uk. I've got all my contact details on there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And to those of you who've been listening, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been absolutely fantastic. If you'd like to get involved with the podcast, feel free to get in touch. Likewise, you can get us and hold of us either through our LinkedIn or through our website. Thank you so much and goodbye.